The late afternoon sun scorched the dusty grounds of Stillwater Ranch, casting long shadows from the wooden fences and bleachers where folks gathered shoulder to shoulder. The arena was tense, every eye fixed on the massive chestnut quarter horse pacing angrily in the ring. His coat gleamed under the light, rich, coppery, and tight over lean muscle. His name was Thunder, and today he had already thrown 2 experienced handlers into the dirt. No one had been able to get close, until now. A hush fell over the crowd as Roy Reeves stepped through the gate. Tall but stooped by age, dressed in worn denim and a pale shirt, his silver hair gently ruffled by the breeze. His face held a calm expression that didn't belong in a place so thick with tension. Most people in town knew Roy only by whispers, a recluse who hadn't spoken a word in decades. What many didn't know was that Roy was deaf, rendered silent by an explosion during his military service over 40 years ago. And yet, here he was, walking straight toward the most volatile horse in the auction. From the stands, Marjorie Lane leaned forward, lips pressed together, hands gripping the iron rail. She'd seen Roy before, from a distance, feeding strays or wandering near the trails at dawn. There was something about him that always felt unfinished. But today, something was different. There was grief in his posture, purpose in his steps. As Thunder snorted and pawed the ground, Roy simply stood still. No rope, no whip, no command. Just silence. Deafening, sacred silence. Chuckles rose from the bleachers. "He's gonna get himself killed," someone muttered. "The old man can't even hear the horse charging." But Roy didn't flinch. He raised his hands, palms open, fingers loose, like offering peace to a wild god. Thunder froze. One step forward. Then another. The massive horse approached, not like a beast ready to attack, but like something drawn to what it didn't understand. And then Roy knelt. Slowly, deliberately, right there in the center of the arena, he brought himself to the dirt. A gesture so vulnerable it sucked the air out of the crowd. Thunder lowered his head and touched Roy's forehead with his own. It wasn't training. It was recognition. It was surrender, not of the horse, but of something long buried in Roy's soul. Tears welled in Marjorie's eyes. What no one in that arena knew, what even Roy hadn't faced until now, was that this very horse had ties to the darkest chapter of his past. A chapter long closed, or so he thought. The arena emptied slowly, as if the crowd feared that walking away would break whatever fragile spell had just been cast. No one spoke to Roy Reeves. They only watched in silence, whispering to each other as he gently walked Thunder back to the holding pen, never tugging on the rope, never giving a command. It was as if the horse had chosen him, and perhaps, in some unknowable way, he had. Marjorie Lane lingered near the bleachers, her eyes still locked on Roy's back. There was something about the way he moved, measured, quiet, like a man walking through memories instead of dirt. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her worn leather notebook, the one she carried since her husband's death. She hadn't written in it in years, but suddenly, words were screaming inside her. That moment between Roy and the horse, it cracked something open in her. Something long frozen. Roy led Thunder into the stall, bolted the gate, and leaned his forehead against the wooden frame. His breath came in shallow pulls. Not from exhaustion, but from something heavier, grief. The horse nudged the gate softly, as if sensing it. Roy reached into his back pocket and pulled out an old photograph, its edges soft from years of wear. The image showed a younger man in uniform, standing beside a chestnut colt. The colt had the same white star on its forehead. Thunder's eyes. Thunder's bloodline. He hadn't planned to come to the auction. Truthfully, he hadn't planned much of anything for a long time. But when he saw Thunder listed in the flyer at the feed store, a chill ran down his spine. The breeder's name, it was the same man Roy had served with in Vietnam. A man who never came home. And the colt in the photo? His name had been Justice. Roy had trained him with bare hands and raw heart, hoping to bring him home after the war. He never did. Now, standing face to face with Thunder, it all made sense. The defiance, the sorrow, the fury behind the eyes. This wasn't just a horse. This was the echo of a life Roy had buried under silence and survival. Thunder was Justice's son. And fate, cruel or kind, had brought him back, demanding Roy confront what he'd locked away decades ago. Outside the stall, Marjorie stepped closer, unsure of what to say. She watched Roy cradle the photo with trembling hands. There was a story here, she knew it. One too big for a whisper, too painful for a question. But one thing was certain, Thunder hadn't just recognized Roy. He had remembered him. The morning after the auction, Stillwater Ranch was quiet, eerily so. The dust had settled, but the echo of what happened the day before still hung in the air. Roy Reeves sat on the edge of his porch, a coffee cup in one hand, though the drink had long gone cold. His other hand rested on Thunder's halter, now resting in his lap. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Justice again. Not the horse, his friend. The man he'd trained beside, fought beside, and buried with his own bare hands in a jungle far from home. Roy ran his thumb across the frayed leather strap, remembering how Justice, the man, used to talk about building a bloodline of horses so bold and loyal they could ride straight through fire. They dreamed of opening a training school when the war ended. But only Roy came back. And he didn't come back whole. Justice had left behind a young wife and a newborn colt. Roy had sent the foal back with the woman after the funeral, never knowing what became of them. Until now. Thunder's soft snort pulled him from the memory. The horse stood nearby, watching him, always watching. Not with the wild suspicion from before, but with something deeper, something Roy hadn't felt in years. Trust. He wondered if Thunder recognized the scent of his father in Roy's hands. Or maybe it was the pain they shared, like two broken branches from the same storm. The horse and the man, both survivors of something that refused to let go. Later that day, a knock at the screen door startled him. Marjorie Lane stood there, holding a pie in one hand and that familiar leather notebook in the other. "I figured you wouldn't come to town," she said softly. "So I brought town to you." Roy opened the door, slowly. His eyes met hers, hesitant but not closed. She handed him the pie, and he nodded, grateful, though no words came. "I don't know what happened out there yesterday," Marjorie continued, her voice trembling slightly, "but it changed something. In me. In everyone who saw it." She paused, her gaze drifting to Thunder, who now stood silently behind Roy, like a sentry. "There's something between you two. Something I think you haven't told anyone." Roy looked down. He didn't need to say it. She was right. Marjorie stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "You don't have to say it out loud," she whispered. "But maybe it's time you let someone help carry it." Roy didn't move. But for the first time in years, he didn't pull away either. 2 days passed, but Roy still hadn't spoken a word. Not with his hands, not with his pen, not even to Thunder. He fed the horse every morning, brushed his coat, let him roam the pasture, but his mind remained locked behind a wall built decades ago. He wanted to believe that the past could stay buried, but Thunder had stirred the ashes. And now they were burning. Marjorie returned each afternoon, never staying long, never pushing. She would sit on the porch with him, share stories about her late husband, the drought that ruined her family's farm, the son who stopped calling after moving to Chicago. Her voice was a gentle hum in the background, never demanding. Sometimes she read aloud from her notebook, poems, old letters, or things she'd never had the courage to say to anyone else. Roy listened in silence, and yet she knew he heard every word. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Roy stood by the fence, watching Thunder gallop freely. The horse's powerful legs kicked up waves of dust, but there was grace in the chaos, controlled fury, focused strength. Just like justice. Roy's hand drifted to his chest, where a silver chain rested under his shirt. He pulled it out. At the end of it, a single army dog tag. Not his, Justice's. He remembered the promise. One made under a sky full of gunfire and smoke. If something happens to me, Roy, find the colt. Train him right. Keep something good in this world. At the time, Roy thought it was a way to soothe fear. He never imagined Justice wouldn't make it home. And when he did, Roy buried that promise along with his voice. That night, Marjorie found him by the barn, the tag clutched in his hand. She didn't speak. She just stood beside him, their shoulders almost touching. Thunder approached slowly, his large eyes reflecting the moonlight. Marjorie reached out and gently stroked his neck. "You know, some souls don't need words to scream," she said. "They just need someone to listen." Roy turned to her, and for the first time, he didn't look away. His eyes shimmered with something raw, unfiltered. Pain, yes, but also something else. Guilt. Regret. And beneath it all, longing. He placed the dog tag into her hand, closed her fingers around it, and stepped back. It wasn't speech, but it was the loudest thing he'd said in 40 years. The next morning brought more than just sunlight. It brought a letter. Marjorie found it tucked under her windshield wiper when she left Roy's ranch. The handwriting was rough, uneven, like it hadn't been used in decades. On the top of the page, only one line was written, "There's something you need to know about that horse." No signature. No explanation. Just the weight of something that refused to stay hidden. Marjorie didn't go straight home. She turned her old truck around and drove to the local archives. The clerk there, a quiet man with thick glasses, remembered her from years ago when she came looking for land records. This time, she asked for military files, specifically, anything connected to Justice Dalton and Roy Reeves. The clerk hesitated but eventually returned with a thin, dusty folder marked unclassified. Inside, she found something that turned her stomach cold. A photo, black and white, taken in Vietnam, showed a young Roy standing over a fallen soldier, face unreadable, holding a horse by the reins. Not a military-issued horse. A young colt. In the margin, someone had scribbled, "Unauthorized livestock transport. Incident under investigation." Below that, another report, signed off but never followed up, "Surviving handler, Roy C. Reeves. Animal evacuated with personal cargo. Subject emotionally compromised." Marjorie's hands shook. She read the documents twice, then again. The colt Roy brought home, it hadn't been approved. He must have smuggled the foal out of the war zone, risking everything. Why? Because it was Justice's last wish? Or was there something else, something deeper? She felt the pull of the truth rising, dark and tangled. This wasn't just about a horse. It never was. By the time she returned to the ranch, Roy was already in the pasture with Thunder. But something was off. The horse was agitated, pacing in circles, snorting harder than usual. Roy stood frozen, staring at him like he'd seen a ghost. As Marjorie approached, she noticed Roy's hands trembling. He didn't turn to look at her. Instead, he held out a second photo, one she hadn't seen before. It showed a Vietnamese village in flames, and a young Roy carrying a child in one arm and leading the colt with the other. And then, he finally spoke, his voice raspy, unused, cracked like old wood. The boy, he was Justice's son. The horse wasn't the only thing I brought home. Marjorie stood in silence, the wind tugging gently at her blouse, but inside, everything was still. Roy's voice hung in the air like a fragile thread, stretching across decades of silence. The boy, he was Justice's son. Her eyes dropped to the photograph he held, now trembling slightly in his hand. A young child, no more than 6, clutched tightly to Roy's side, ash smudged across his cheeks, confusion in his eyes. Thunder's sire, the original colt, was in the background, untouched by the smoke, as if tethered to all of it and none of it at once. Roy sat down slowly on a wooden crate by the fence, his knees weak from more than just age. "I couldn't find her," he said hoarsely. "Justice's widow. After the attack, everything was gone. The house, the town, no records. I found the boy near what was left of their village. He didn't speak, just followed me. Held on to that colt like it was the last thing he had." His voice cracked. "It was." Marjorie sat beside him, placing the photo in her lap. Her heart ached not just for Roy, but for that forgotten child. "What happened to him?" she asked gently. Roy closed his eyes, took a shaky breath. "I tried to bring him home. Told the embassy he was my responsibility. They wouldn't take him. Said I didn't have the legal right. I begged, offered everything. But in the end," his voice dropped to a whisper, "they took him from me." The silence that followed was suffocating. Thunder stood at the edge of the fence, watching the two of them with ears tilted forward, sensing the storm in Roy's chest. Marjorie reached over and touched Roy's hand, the skin cold despite the heat of the day. "You did everything you could," she said. But Roy shook his head slowly. "Not enough. I let him go. And I never found out what became of him." They both looked at Thunder then. Strong, defiant, but with an unmistakable sorrow in his posture. "I always thought Thunder carried Justice's legacy," Roy said quietly. "But now I wonder if, maybe he carries more than that. A memory. A piece of that boy. A spirit that never found peace." Marjorie wiped a tear from her cheek, barely holding her voice steady. "Roy, what if finding Thunder wasn't an accident? What if it's not just about the past, but what's still waiting to be found?" Roy looked at her, eyes full of fear and hope colliding. For the first time in 40 years, he didn't feel alone. Roy didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the barn with Thunder, the photo of the boy clenched in his fist and the old army dog tag around his neck. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the wind reminded him of what he'd lost and what he might still find. The boy's face, smudged with soot and grief, was now burned into his thoughts. He had memorized every curve of those small eyes, every shadow under his cheekbones. He was no longer just a memory. He was a mission not yet complete. By dawn, Marjorie returned, notebook in hand and a firm look in her eyes. She had spent half the night calling old contacts, veterans she knew through her late husband, nurses who had worked with Vietnamese war orphans, even a former journalist who once wrote about missing children after the war. She wasn't sure what she hoped to find, but something in her spirit refused to let the story die in Roy's silence. "I talked to a man in Austin," she told Roy. He remembered a transfer program that sent children from Vietnamese orphanages to foster homes here in the States. Quiet operation. Kept off the books for political reasons. But he's got a list of names and photos. Roy's eyes widened, not with hope, but with fear. "It's been 40 years, he signed slowly. "Even if he's alive, I wouldn't know him now." Marjorie placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "But maybe he would know you." She handed him a printout, 3 photos, all of men in their 40s, born in Vietnam, adopted through the same program. One of them, he breeds horses. Quarter horses. Out in New Mexico. Roy's hands trembled as he studied the faces. The last photo stopped him cold. A man with dark eyes, a scar above his left eyebrow, and standing behind him in the distance was a horse that looked like Thunder's mirror. Thunder neighed suddenly, loud and urgent, snapping them both back into the moment. He paced along the fence, ears pulled back, hooves striking the dirt as if something inside him remembered, too. Roy stood, gripping the photo like a lifeline, his breathing sharp and uneven. The connection was no longer just spiritual. It was tangible. It was alive. For the first time in decades, Roy felt his purpose return. Not just to right a wrong, but to find the piece of himself he'd left behind in a burning village and a broken promise. And now, with Thunder at his side and Marjorie by his shoulder, the road ahead no longer felt like punishment. It felt like redemption. The road to New Mexico stretched like a ribbon of unfinished business across the horizon. Roy hadn't driven that far in over 20 years, but his hands didn't shake on the wheel. Thunder rode quietly in the trailer behind, as if he, too, understood what this journey meant. Marjorie sat in the passenger seat, the photo of the man with the scar resting on her lap. No one had said much since they left Stillwater Ranch. Some stories didn't need to be repeated, they just needed to be finished. They arrived at the outskirts of a modest ranch near Taos by late afternoon. The air was dry and thin, the land open and wild. Horses grazed in the distance, and Roy could see the barn doors wide open, dust swirling in the sun. A young stable hand greeted them and pointed them toward the far pasture. "Mr. Dalton's out there," he said. The name struck Roy like a silent bell. Dalton. Justice's last name. The boy had kept it. Roy walked slowly through the field, Thunder beside him, his halter loose in Roy's hands. As they approached the pasture, a man stepped out of the shade of a cottonwood tree. Mid-40s, tall, lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes that mirrored Roy's memories. The scar above his eyebrow caught the light, faint but unmistakable. He wore a denim shirt and leather gloves, and when he saw Thunder, his posture shifted, like something ancient stirred in him. The man approached cautiously, his eyes never leaving the horse. "I've only ever seen one like him," he said softly. "When I was a kid. But I thought maybe it was just a dream." Roy's throat tightened. His hand reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the photo, the same boy, ashes on his cheeks, holding the original colt's mane. He handed it to the man, who took it slowly, staring in stunned silence. "My name is Matthew Dalton," the man finally said. "I was adopted when I was 7. I don't remember much before that. Just fire, running, and a man who smelled like sweat and smoke, who wrapped me in his jacket and whispered something I couldn't understand." His voice cracked. "That was you, wasn't it?" Roy nodded, lips pressed shut, eyes burning. Thunder stepped forward then and nudged Matthew's arm, gently, almost reverently. And just like that, 3 lifetimes of silence collapsed into one sacred moment of recognition. The 3 of them, Roy, Matthew, and Thunder, stood in the fading light, suspended in a silence that wasn't awkward, but sacred. It was the kind of silence born when words are too small to carry the weight of truth. Roy wanted to say everything he'd held back for decades, but his throat refused. What could he possibly say to a man he once tried, and failed, to protect as a child? Matthew held the photo close to his chest. His voice, when it came, was gentle. "I don't remember much about Vietnam. Just flashes, smoke, fear, and a hand that held mine like I was worth saving." He looked at Roy. "I never thought that man was real. I thought maybe I made him up, just so I wouldn't feel so lost." Roy's eyes filled with tears, his weathered hands twitching at his sides. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Then, slowly, he reached out and pulled Matthew into a rough, trembling embrace. Marjorie watched from a distance, hands pressed to her heart. She had seen many things in her lifetime: death, distance, silence, but never something this quietly holy. As the 2 men stood locked in an embrace of memory and forgiveness, Thunder walked a slow circle around them, almost protectively. It was as if the horse had been waiting his whole life to witness this reunion, to close the loop his bloodline had started. Later that night, gathered around a small fire behind Matthew's barn, the 3 of them shared stories in broken fragments. Roy, in short sentences and the occasional rough whisper. Matthew, in questions he'd carried like stones. And Marjorie, weaving the threads between them. When Roy finally pulled the army dog tag from around his neck and handed it to Matthew, neither of them spoke. The firelight reflected in both pairs of eyes, one old, one weathered by absence, but finally, together. "I named my first horse Justice," Matthew said, voice low. "Didn't know why at the time. Just felt right." Roy let out a sound, half laugh, half cry. "His name was Justice," he managed. "Your father." The weight of that name settled between them like a prayer. For the first time, the past didn't feel like a curse. It felt like a path, one that led them here. But even with this reunion, Roy knew there was still one more thing left to do. A promise made in war, fulfilled in part, but not yet complete. He looked at Thunder, then at the horizon. There was one place he still had to return to. One goodbye he still needed to speak. The next morning, Roy stood at the edge of a small hill just outside Stillwater Ranch, where the grass grew tall and the wind moved like a whisper. He had chosen this place for a reason. Years ago, long before his silence began, this was where he and Justice used to ride after long days of training. It was quiet here, peaceful. It felt right. Beside him, Thunder stood still, his chestnut coat shimmering in the early light. At Roy's side, clutched tightly in his hand, was a small wooden box. Marjorie and Matthew waited nearby, giving Roy space but not leaving him alone. Inside the box were two things: the last letter Justice had ever written, one Roy had kept all these years without the courage to read aloud, and the small, bent photo of the boy he once tried to save. Roy knelt slowly, his knees protesting, and dug a shallow hole beneath the tree where the sun first hit in the morning. With trembling hands, he placed the box into the earth. He stayed kneeling long after he covered it. Thunder stepped closer, gently nuzzling Roy's shoulder. Roy closed his eyes. For decades, he'd carried guilt like a second skin, guilt for surviving, for failing, for letting go. But now, the burden felt lighter. He hadn't saved everyone, but he had saved something. And in that, there was peace. Matthew approached, his footsteps soft. "He would have been proud of you," he said. "My father." Roy looked up, the emotion clear in his eyes. "He was the best man I ever knew," Roy whispered. "And he saved me, more than I ever saved him." Matthew nodded. "Now, maybe it's time we both stop surviving and start living." Marjorie joined them, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "The past will always echo," she said gently. "But it doesn't have to haunt. What you've done, what you've rebuilt here, it matters. It's more than memory. It's legacy." The three of them stood together, watching as Thunder walked forward and stopped beside the buried box, lowering his head as if in quiet acknowledgement. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of dust, leather, and forgiveness. As the sun rose fully over the hill, Roy turned to the two people who had unknowingly helped him reclaim his voice. He didn't say much, he never needed to. But what he did say, finally, was enough. "Let's go home." And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where that was.